What if I told you that there is a version of Cell that never died, and a version of Cell that no one really cares about because no one really cares about the timeline that he exists in? For those of you who have followed this channel for years, you already know without a shadow of a doubt what I'm about to say. And for those of you who are new, you probably have no clue. This is the Cell of the Unseen timeline. Years ago, I made an alternate timeline video about the 4 confirmed timelines of Dragon Ball Z. Of course, Dragon Ball Super added 3 more, but that's another conversation for another day. Months ago, I made a video focused on a specific timeline called the Unseen Timeline of Dragon Ball Z. So if you want a deeper explanation as to how that timeline exists, check that out. But for today, we will briefly explain its existence for new viewers. Here are 2 quick reasons to prove how we know the Unseen Timeline exists. Number 1, it didn't involve our Future Trunks. In the original 4 timelines of Dragon Ball Z, there are 2 dark timelines and 2 fixed, or shall we say, light timelines. Our Future Trunks is from the Hot timeline, which is an acronym for the History of Trunks timeline. But before this timeline and the main timeline that we have in Dragon Ball that we see, we had the original timeline where the first Cell came from and where the original Future Trunks came from. And in the original timeline, this is where Cell takes Future Trunks' time machine and creates 2 different timelines. But the Unseen Timeline was the timeline that the first Future Trunks created. This Trunks killed the androids of his future without a major power-up. This is obvious because if he got a major power-up, then Cell would not have been able to kill him. Cell mentions that Trunks somehow mysteriously killed the androids. This leads Piccolo to making the conclusion that Trunks was going to go back to the past to tell his friends that he killed the androids. Now there are several plot holes associated with this, but this scene leads us to the moment of truth. This version of Trunks must have used a shutdown device in order to kill 17 and 18, and he acquired this device by going to the Unseen Timeline. So now that we know the Unseen Timeline exists, what happened to Cell exactly? Well, the development of Cell is something that was never going to be finished until many years into the future. And to be specific, we see 2 anime filler flashbacks that expand on this. In one flashback, we get a chance to see the androids killing Dr. Gero in the future. Right after, we see that Cell was a fetus in Dr. Gero's lab in the future when the androids destroyed the lab. But Cell wasn't destroyed and developed later on. In another flashback sequence, when Cell was fighting against Super Saiyan Grade 3 Trunks, we see Cell explaining that he killed lots of humans in the future, but it wasn't enough and he needed the androids. Henceforth, he killed the Future Trunks of the original timeline and stole his time machine. This ultimately means that in the Unseen Timeline, one of 2 things is true. And to be specific and to simplify, remember that the Unseen Timeline is the first fixed, or shall we say, light timeline, in parallel to the original timeline being the first and the original dark timeline. So going back to Cell, on one hand, Cell stayed in the underground lab and developed many years into the future with no one paying attention to him. On the other hand, we have an extremely unlikely case that Trunks or whoever accompanied him in the Unseen Timeline killed Cell in his pod. The reason why the latter is extremely unlikely is because the Trunks from the original timeline that traveled to the Unseen Timeline had no awareness of Cell at all. But the Trunks from the Hot timeline, History of Trunks timeline, that traveled to the main timeline became aware of Cell because of the confrontation with Piccolo. So as a result, he and Krillin killed Cell. Now let's analyze the outcome of the Cell that stayed in the pod and developed. In this situation, Cell would develop very far into the future. Now we have to point out that we don't fully know the state of the Unseen Timeline. The Z Fighters in the Unseen Timeline don't have to worry about the time-traveling Cell from the original timeline because that Cell went to the main timeline and he also died by Gohan, so he's no longer a threat. In reality, they would only have to worry about the androids, at least for the short term. Considering the fact that it's interpreted by Piccolo that Trunks wanted to tell those from the Unseen Timeline that he killed the androids, this clearly indicates that our heroes solved their android threat problem because Trunks obviously feels that he's going back to the past to talk to people who are alive. Because if they didn't somehow defeat the androids, then why would he go back to try and tell them that he defeated them? Now, to be honest with you, this is actually a plot hole written by Dragon Ball, and I actually addressed this in another video called Future Trunks' Secret Mission to Kill Dr. Gero if you want to get like an alternate view on this. But for now, we're just gonna go with what the show tells us. So this ultimately leaves us with a major judgment call. In the unseen timeline, it makes the most sense that our heroes stop the androids via a shutdown device instead of training to kill them. Even though it's not canon, Super Android 13 heavily implies this and is essentially a what-if scenario where 17 and 18 were released, but there's no Android 16, so somehow our characters survived against the androids without having to worry about Cell. So the androids were either deactivated or were not as evil as the future counterparts in parallel to the main timeline, and our heroes simply didn't have a reason to kill them. Now this brings up a question about Cell. What will happen to him? Well, let's take out all of the random ultimatum possibilities. These include Zeno randomly erasing everybody, or a situation where Frieza or some other villain comes to Earth and kills everyone. The first character we must discuss is Piccolo, because we don't know if Piccolo fused with Kami in this timeline, but we can make a safe argument that he did, because in all likelihood this timeline is most likely identical to the main timeline, up until the point where Cell shows up in one timeline and doesn't in the other. Now we must factor in Vegeta. With all of these major changes, it's next to impossible to predict how he would behave exactly. He wouldn't be a villain in all likelihood, but would probably still live on Earth as an aggressive anti-hero. But because Goku is around, he wouldn't soften up and become a family man. This leads us to Gohan now. Because Trunks traveling to the past was most beneficial for Gohan more than anybody else, this even includes Goku who still ended up dying anyways, Gohan's training in the Room of Spirit and Time made him stronger than everyone else and strong enough to defeat a completed Cell with a souped up Zenkai boost. Without these key events, Gohan would never train as much and would at best attain Super Saiyan over time. And that's a generous estimate because with Chi-Chi not wanting Gohan to train and him not knowing Super Saiyan before the Room of Spirit and Time, it's extremely doubtful that he would even attain Super Saiyan. Now this leads us to a tricky situation in the future when Babidi and Dabura came to Earth. Our heroes needed all of the events in the main timeline to fight against future threats. In Goku's case specifically, since he wouldn't have died in all likelihood, this means that he wouldn't be dead to push his body farther and to get much stronger in the afterlife by learning Super Saiyan 3. In addition, Goku wouldn't have learned the Metamori's art of fusion to teach Goten and Trunks and any other potential user in the future. So this means in all likelihood that by the time Babidi and Dabura showed up, they wouldn't be able to get enough energy for boost since Goku, Vegeta, and Gohan would all be much weaker, but they should theoretically be able to kill those three since these characters would be much weaker, including Piccolo. And this leads us to how Cell would develop into a dark world. If Babidi's crew was able to kill our heroes and don't blow up Earth, this means that Cell would simply develop into a world without enough energy and no ability to use a time machine, so he would stay in his imperfect form forever, just roaming the Earth or the universe since he can survive in space and he has no reason to really be on Earth anymore. Now on a positive note, if our heroes were somehow able to defeat Babidi and Dabura, then by the time that Cell develops way into the future, they would be strong enough to kill an imperfect version of Cell, because if you can get past Dabura, then you can clearly defeat an imperfect Cell. And at that point, the real threat would really just be Cell deciding to blow up Earth randomly when everybody's off guard, when he realizes that he stands absolutely no chance, and when he also realizes that he can't absorb the androids because they're gone. Now the androids themselves are also another question, because we also have to make the assumption that they were deactivated, because if the original Future Trunks was able to go back to his timeline and deactivate the androids, that's how he would feel confident that they would work in his future timeline. But there's also a small possibility that the androids of the unseen timeline are a parallel to the main timeline androids in the sense where they're not necessarily evil like the future androids, because the main timeline and the unseen timeline are parallel light universes. And because of this, it's possible that the androids could have just been bandits on Earth, not really causing any problem for our heroes, and our heroes would just survive because the androids aren't really evil and Cell is not there. But the reason why I don't think this is realistic ultimately is because of Android 16. Depending on whether or not 16 showed up in the unseen timeline or not is a big question, because if he did show up, in all likelihood our heroes would have to have found a way to defeat him, because 16 was hellbent on killing Goku. And if 16 didn't exist or was somehow not activated in the unseen timeline, then that's scratched off. And let's not also forget that if 16 did exist, he does have a bomb that is capable of completely wiping everybody out, because we would assume in the unseen timeline that he wouldn't get friendly and wouldn't have his bomb removed by Bulma and Dr. Briefs. Now, going back to the possibility of Cell just blowing up the planet and our heroes just die, there is a potential saving grace with the Namekians on New Namek, who can always make a wish to help out. But in this video, we're focusing strictly on what our heroes can do without any other major third-party assistance. And remember that these two outcomes are a branch from the outcome of Cell not being killed in a pod in Dr. Gero's lab. Because there's also the other possibility that Trunks could have killed him when he destroyed Dr. Gero's entire lab, assuming he destroyed Dr. Gero's entire lab in the unseen timeline, and as a result of it, that's another possibility of Cell being killed. Now, if you enjoyed this video, you definitely need to watch. Is Trunks' secret mission to kill Dr. Gero, the original alternate timeline video where I explain all 4 timelines of Dragon Ball Z, and a more recent one where I specifically explain the unseen timeline of Dragon Ball Z. And until next time, stay cool and stay safe, my friends.